was een feit.
Ja, begint. Nu ga ik met een wafel houden. Selection. Beter, maar niet duurder.
Tussen 1921 en 1929 presenteerde Amerika zichzelf als de ideale samenleving, ondanks de drooglegging en de stijgende misdaad. De industrie groeide als nooit tevoren. Het contrast met het vorige decennium van de Grote Oorlog kon niet groter zijn. De politieke en financiële bonzen verkondigden dezelfde boodschap van vertrouwen, duurzame welvaart en welzijn. Op het eind van de jaren 20 ging de economische opgang over in algemene euforie. In de roes van de Roaring Twenties had je de eerste Miss Amerika-verkiezingen, de eerste Oscar-uitreikingen en de eerste musicals. Allemaal op de tonen van de jazz.
We hit a new stage of affluence. Suddenly, most American families owned an automobile. Only 10 years before they didn't. They owned electric washing machines, electric refrigerators, electric record players. The talkies, sound movies started in 1927. So it looked like a new age. I think people were warning it couldn't last. But for the most part, America believed maybe there would be a little pullback, a slowdown, but we were in a new time, a new economy.
The 1920s marks the beginning of the automobile moving to the center of American culture, and it meant that even working class people were eager to buy a car.
Credit becomes something that people can rely on. Credit for consumer purchasers, like buying a Model T Ford or buying a car, comes in as a phenomenon.
In 1919 waren er 6 miljoen auto's in Amerika. 10 jaar later 27 miljoen. 1 op de 5 Amerikanen had toen al een auto.
Consumer culture blossoms in America. Installment credit buying blossoms in America. It's the age of the flapper, of bootleg gin, of jazz. It's also a period of enormous excitement about the stock market, where all kinds of ordinary people, not just the stock market professionals who'd always participated in Wall Street, but ordinary folk began to see Wall Street as a place to play, to grow rich quickly, a place that was largely risk-free. Therefore, the 20s in America is a period in which Wall Street, for the first time in its history, is associated with play culture, with getting drunk, with sexual abandon, with consumer delights. Wall Street becomes a part of that larger way of life.
Steeds meer Amerikanen gingen op de beurs spelen. In 5 jaar tijd stegen de prijzen op de aandelenmarkt met 400%. Die enorme groei lijkt onbegrijpelijk en kwam niet overeen met de economische realiteit op dat ogenblik. In Wall Street lag het geld voor het rapen. In 1929 werd 2 miljard geïnvesteerd op de beurs.
People, particularly Americans, have always been trying to get rich fast. The difference is that in the 1920s, it seemed like there were more ways than ever before to try to do that, and the stock market was one of those ways. It was a new kind of wealth to people. You'd go in and you'd buy a stock, let's say at 20, and you didn't know anything about the stock market. And the next day the stock is 23, and the next day it's 27, and you haven't lifted a finger. And boy, that was easy. If I just keep doing this, I'll make a lot of money and I won't have to do anything. And it got to the point where people became addicted to the market.
And they're ordinary people. They're salaried workers, they're middle-class folks, they're shoeshine boys, they're housewives. They're ordinary folk like you and me. This is an extraordinary new phenomenon, and they are giddy about it.
People would feel foolish not participating in the money that was almost there to pick off the ground. There was this kind of collective herding mentality.
John Jacob Raskob, head of General Motors, assures everybody that the economy is safe, sound, and guaranteed to be prosperous. In fact, he writes a very famous article that appears in the Ladies' Home Journal. Everybody ought to be rich, he says in this article, and he tells them how. And this appears 1 year before the great crash of 1929.
Diezelfde baas van GM schreef: als je elke maand $15 spaart en er aandelen mee koopt, dan heb je na 1 of 2 jaar $80.000. De financiële pers noemde Raskob een visionair. In Wall Street sloeg de goudkoorts toe.
There are ticker tapes in beauty parlors. There are ticker tapes on railroad trains. There are ticker tapes in bar rooms. There are ticker tapes on ocean liners. So that for the first time, speculating in the market becomes a kind of part of everyday life. It had never been that before. So you have brokerages springing up in small towns, in villages, in small cities all across America. Toggled together by electronic wire to the headquarters on Wall Street, encouraging people to participate in the street. It becomes a kind of sport that people are all playing together.
It wasn't the lower class that was buying stock, it was the middle class. Because one of the things that happens in the 1920s as part of this whole pattern of the new consumer culture is banks are more willing to loan, to make relatively small loans to individuals on no real collateral. That had never been done before.
Eén op de 3 Amerikanen vertrouwde zijn spaarcenten toe aan de tovenaars van Wall Street. Je hoefde het geld niet eens te hebben. Je kreeg krediet bij de vleet. Iedereen verdiende een fortuin. De speculanten, de banken en de beursmakelaars. De investeringsmaatschappijen schoten als paddenstoelen uit de grond. Elke dag werd wel een nieuw bedrijf opgericht.
People speculate by borrowing the money on margin. That is, they put up a very small percentage of their own money to purchase a stock, maybe 10%, maybe 20%, maybe even less than 10%. And credit is so available, and everybody is so super confident, overconfident that these speculations will pay off in the end, that people are taking enormous credit risks in investing in the market.
As long as the price of the stock went up, your collateral in the loan was always covered, and it looked like the easiest thing in the world, and you get twice the bang for your buck. But once it starts to fall, the stock price starts to fall, then you have to put in more cash to cover the what's called the margin, the difference between the amount you borrowed and what the stock is now worth.
Prosperity is just around the corner. What we'd like to know.
De voorspoed ligt om de hoek. Met die campagneslogan werd Herbert Hoover tot nieuwe president verkozen. Er werd zelfs een liedje van gemaakt. Net als de grootste economen vond Hoover dat de groei op de aandelenmarkt gerechtvaardigd was door de stabiele prijzen, de bloei en de goede vooruitzichten van de Amerikaanse economie.
He had a golden opportunity in his inaugurals to say, stock is too high, we need to do something about the market. But as a politician, if he does that and the market then goes down, as it probably would and should, everybody would blame him for causing the crash. So he didn't do that.
The election has again confirmed the determination of the American people, and opportunity must be given for the expression of popular will, and we should keep it so.
When Hoover said that, the market took off again. During the summer of 1929, June, July, and August, when normally the market's slow because it's summer, people are on vacation and so forth, the market went crazy.
Political and financial leaders celebrated this euphoria and this reckless speculation. This is everybody from President Herbert Hoover and includes the nation's chief bankers. And the country is so overcome by this sense of confidence. And they're being encouraged in this confidence by apparently the most prudent, savvy people in the country. The country's financial elite is saying everything's fine.
It drove stock prices up to irrational, even silly levels. Despite those crazy levels, as in all speculative booms, there were people who said, the stock market is right. Those high levels are deserved.
The best experts, the risk experts, saying, don't worry, it will never happen. And besides, you can diversify, and if it goes down in one place, it'll only be in one place, other places it won't. That's absurd.
In 1929, you had a stock market that had been going up, 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 and as it kept going up, it sort of cut loose from its moorings, by which I mean instead of being based on real values of the underlying companies, it was a speculator's market in which people bought and sold stock thinking that if they bought it now, they could sell it later for more money.
Investment pools were conspiracies, really, of insiders. Top investment bankers, sometimes politicians, who wanted to speculate in a particular stock. And so they would buy up huge amounts of that stock, send its price, therefore, skyrocketing, then quickly and secretly dump the stock so that they could realize the profits, while all those ordinary folk who had been encouraged to buy that same stock because they were watching its escalation were left with the losings.
You can make more and more by taking bigger and bigger risks. Taking bigger and bigger risks led to higher and higher prices for stocks and willingness to borrow excessively in order to do that. And that created a structure that once it cracked, came apart completely.
There were people who saw that the economy's growth was based on false premises and warned that a problem would arise.
There are a handful of Wall Street bankers, investment bankers, who say that the economy and the market itself is way overextended, that speculation on margin is dangerous, that the stock market, the values on the stock market are grossly inflated, warning that that there are danger signs. There are some people like the statistician Roger Babson, and they are systematically ignored.
In september, een maand voor de beursval, verklaarde Roger Babson: vroeg of laat komt er een crash en hij zal reusachtig zijn. De effectenmarkt zal bezwijken onder zijn eigen gewicht, met een ongeziene stormloop tot gevolg.
The higher the market got, the more other people shouted down those who warned that the market was getting out of control. Because if people started taking them seriously, they'd start to sell their stock and the stock market would go down.
There were signs before the market crashed that the economy was starting to go down again. Short-term signs of economic recession can never be trusted. We always have pauses and sometimes economies come back, but there were signs of over-speculation all over the place, in particular the high level of stock prices, which were very hard to justify on any historical basis. But there were investment trusts that average people were putting their money in. Investment trusts were able to borrow a lot of money to invest in stocks. Average people, typical people, were borrowing money on their own to buy individual stocks, margin borrowing. So there were all kinds of signs that there was trouble to come.
It began to sort of vacillate through September. And then in October, it began to fall. And then in about the third week in October, the bottom started to fall out.
And that's usually a sign when the bubble will burst, and it did in October of 1929.
The crash of 1929 was like a perfect storm in which all of these improbable things came together at the wrong time in the wrong way.
Op Zwarte Donderdag 24 oktober sloeg de collectieve krankzinnigheid toe. In luttele uren werden 13 miljoen aandelen in paniek op de markt gedumpt. De beleggers wisten niet eens voor welke prijs ze hun aandelen verkochten. Na 3 jaar speculatie stortte Wall Street in elkaar. En niemand kon de markt sluiten, want het hoofd van de beurs was met vakantie in Hawaii. De verliezen liepen op tot wel $30 miljard. Dat is 10 keer zoveel als het budget van de Amerikaanse centrale bank en meer dan het land tijdens de hele Eerste Wereldoorlog had uitgegeven. De gemiddelde prijs zakte in 6 dagen met 50% en ze bleef zakken. En merkwaardig genoeg deinde de beurscrash verder uit.
Oh, the crash was inevitable. It was just a matter of time. It was inevitable. And then people realized that they had been assuming that prices would never fall, and that assumption was wrong. So their whole life had been based on an assumption that prices could go only one way. Of course, if they had read history, they would know that that was a stupid idea. They know that prices come up and prices come down.
People had been putting their hand in the till at work, taking the money, putting it in the market, figuring that it's going to go up, so it'll go up, I'll cash in, put the money back in the till, no one will be the wiser. But when the market crashed, there was no way to get the money back out.
All of a sudden, they realized the model that had been in their mind was totally wrong. And realizing that they were wrong, they panic. But as they panic, what do they see? Their neighbor panic.
On the market itself, of course, the brokers are going crazy. They're tearing their hair out. They can't keep up with the descent of the market. Many people lose their money because the trades they tried to make couldn't be made in time at the prices they were trying to make them because the market was so over, the capacity to handle those trades wasn't there anymore. The wires are burning up.
The ticker tape, which recorded all the sales, couldn't keep up, and it would fall several hours behind. And when it fell that far behind, that means that if you were at 2 o'clock and you only knew what the market was doing at 10:30, you were in big trouble because you didn't know what had happened.
And as it was going down, those who were slower said, oh, I made a mistake. I wish I'd been faster. And the process accelerates, and you get this sense of free fall.
There was something fundamentally wrong with this economy, not only with the market, with the stock market, not only that stocks were grossly overvalued, but there were underlying problems with the economy, that this illusion of prosperity that had so captivated people for nearly a decade was indeed an illusion, and that the panic was a kind of inarticulate emotional recognition of that fact, because, in other words, it was grounded in something real. It wasn't pure hysteria.
beursgebouw leek wel een station bij het begin van de vakantieuitocht. Er werd massaal verkocht. Mensen verdrongen elkaar om te zien wat er gaande was. Voor een leek waren al die cijfers en letters Latijn, maar ze beloofden alvast niks goeds. Op de beursvloer lagen duizenden geschrapte aandelenorders, als lege hulzen op een slagveld.
The Great Crash is supposed to have produced mass suicides on Wall Street and elsewhere. It became the object of a kind of gallows humor. There were cartoons about Wall Street bankers jumping out of windows and so on. It's a grossly exaggerated legend.
De wildste geruchten deden de ronde. 11 speculanten zouden zich van kant hebben gemaakt. De baas van het Ritz liet zijn hotelgasten vooraf betalen, want ze gingen misschien uit het raam springen.
There were indeed some suicides, not very many. One of the most notable, however, was witnessed by Winston Churchill. Churchill was visiting New York at the time of the crash. He first visited the stock market and was struck by not the panic on the market floor, but by a kind of dazed somnambulism of brokers walking around almost as if they were in a kind of semi-comatose state. And then he went back to his hotel, and while he was in his hotel, someone indeed did jump out the window of the hotel he was staying with, who turned out to be a Wall Street broker who had been ruined.
President Hoover kwam op Zwarte Donderdag niet naar Wall Street. Hij dronk liever thee met Marie Curie, die op bezoek was in het Witte Huis. Hij vertelde haar dat het land vol zelfvertrouwen was en een voorspoedige toekomst tegemoet ging. Intussen probeerden geruïneerde zakenlui voor het verlaten beursgebouw hun luxewagens voor een peulschil van de hand te doen.
The reaction, the official reaction to the crash of the market is a sense of shock, disbelief, and hubris, a sense that if they act and simply assure people that everything is all right, the market will immediately recover. John D. Rockefeller goes and buys some stock in a very public way to show that he too is confident that the economy is sound and the market is sound.
John Rockefeller, de rijkste man op aarde, zag zijn fortuin met 80% slinken.
In the 93 years of my life, depressions have come and gone. Prosperity has always returned and will again.
It tries to assure everybody that the market is sound, that this is a temporary lull, and this act of buying up stock is a display of confidence in the market. And it doesn't work. Herbert Hoover, the president of the country, issues pronouncements that the underlying structure of the economy is sound, that people need not fear or panic. But everybody does indeed panic. And the panic is irreversible. It's extraordinary. It even has a sound to it. 10,000 people gather outside the New York Stock Exchange. The city is very afraid. They order mounted police. They think there's going to be a storming of the Bastille that is a storming of the New York Stock Exchange. And that crowd gathers there and stays there for weeks and is a kind of low hum that kind of is emitted from the crowd, a kind of dull roar, it's like the sound of panic, the sound of anxiety.
Crowds which you see gathered outside the stock exchange are due to the greatest crash in the history of the New York Stock Exchange and market prices.
Herbert Hoover very, very quickly, once the crash hits, loses credibility in the eyes of the American people. He's doing nothing. He's making constant false assurances that always turn out to be untrue.
His statements about prosperity being around the corner were an attempt to give confidence to the market. No president is going to say we're about to have a disaster. But because they were false promises, when the reality showed them to be inconsistent with what they had said, it actually discredited Hoover.
He himself, I think, is so stunned by what has happened, so confident that the market will recover.
The crash was not the event of one day. It really spread out across a week, and it's sort of, the fall went on for almost 3 weeks, from late October into middle November. After that, the market began to recover, and it actually gained back during the winter something like a third of what it had lost. And it looked like recovery was on the way. Everybody was looking not at the market, but at the economy, what was going to happen.
De beurs verloor in totaal zo'n 80%. Wall Street sleurde de hele Amerikaanse economie mee in zijn val.
It really snowballs after 1929. More and more banks fail. If you have money in a bank and the bank fails, you've lost it all. So that means there's a run on the bank, and there is literally a financial crisis.
Het falen van de banken sloeg het volk met verstomming. Waren zij niet de onverwoestbare pijlers van het kapitalisme?
People are desperate and the banking system is collapsed. There's an enormous liquidity crunch. There's no credit available to restart the engines of the economy.
One of the controversies, 29, was what role did the central bank play? Would it have been able to reverse it if allowed, provided more money to the banking system?
The complete evaporation of confidence in the economy, and in the financial sector particularly, means there's no credit available.
So it was a period of falling, decline in economic activity that finally led to a financial crisis that then, of course, continued the downward spiral of the economy.
Suddenly, a banking community will not be able to lend money. People will not be able to buy houses. That feeds on itself, and that's how recessions work. Businesses start to lay off workers. They can't get loans to meet their payroll. They can't get loans to keep their businesses going. Businesses go out of business. More people are let go. Other people are afraid they will be let go. They stop spending. You spend less money. Business makes even less profit. More businesses go under. And all of this feeds on itself, and the economy sinks into this sort of death spiral, or at least coma spiral, let's call it. But that takes time. Markets can collapse in a few days, but the economy sinking takes time.
When the economy collapsed, there was no reservoir of consumer purchasing power to buoy it up again.
And people began to lose jobs. Then you get this shift. And once that mood shift starts, it's very, very hard to reverse again.
And so you get this escalating crisis that begins as a banking crisis, but becomes a general economic crisis.
People stop buying things. They start worrying about the future, whereas before the future looked like nothing but bright because the market was going up. They had money. But as soon as the market crashes and the underlying causes start to seep in, like the housing market.
Once the house prices stopped growing, the whole house of cards collapsed. As business failed, they couldn't repay the loans. The only way they could do it by borrowing more and more. But that process had to come to an end.
They thought that they had made their life, and then suddenly the floor dropped out from under them, and they started to lose it all again. I mean, who's hurt by a depression? The poor have always been poor. You know, this is not anything particularly new to them. It's a little harder. The rich, if you've got $20 million and you lose 10 or 12 million, you can still scrape by on that other 8 million. It's the middle class, the ones who are new to that lifestyle, And the middle class on that level, as I said, because of the consumer economy, was grounded in the possession of material things, whether it's an automobile, whether it's clothes, whether it's your house or whatever. And all of that is one by one taken away from them.
And so the economy continues to descend and descend and descend, no matter what Hoover is prepared to do, and he's prepared to do not very much.
The kinds of views that Hoover advocated were the kinds of policies that made the Great Depression as bad as it was. He refused to really have the kind of stimulus that the country needed. There was really a lack of comprehension of the depth of the problems and the appropriate policies to respond to it.
The result of the World War and its aftermath.
Amerika had geld geleend aan Duitsland, maar om het vertrouwen van de financiële wereld op te krikken, besloot Hoover dat kapitaal versneld weer in te trekken. Dat was een monumentale fout met desastreuze gevolgen. Duitsland, dat de wonden van de oorlog nog likte, werd opnieuw hard getroffen.
World War I was not forgotten in 1929. There was still a lot of anger, and the Depression gave the Hoover administration and the Republicans at the time the opportunity to vent their anger, among other things. There is no way it would have saved the day by repatriating that money.
Les propriétaires américains ont rapatrié leurs capitaux, ce qui a asséché des banques, qui a asséché l'économie allemande, etc. Et donc il y a eu un jeu avec les capitaux américains très déstabilisateur. Donc autrement dit, c'est une strangulation progressive qui était programmée.
I don't think they were fully aware of the implications of what they were doing.
L'histoire du monde a basculé à ce moment-là. C'est pas parce qu'aux États-Unis, on a connu pendant 2 ou 3 ans un taux de chômage à 25%. C'est pas ça. Ce qui fait qu'on reste traumatisé par la crise de 29, c'est parce qu'elle a traversé l'Atlantique et que le premier pays européen qui est touché par la crise, c'est l'Allemagne. Et la raison pour laquelle l'Allemagne est la première touchée, c'est que la reconstruction allemande n'a pu être faite en Allemagne que par le financement de capitaux américains qui se sont immédiatement retirés au premier moment de la crise de 1929, retirant le tapis sous les pieds de l'Allemagne et la faisant basculer.
De eerste terugbetaling was al meteen de doodsteek voor de Duitse economie. De Reichsbank moest voor 14 miljoen mark aan goud en valuta terugsturen. De investeerders waren geruïneerd en de lege banken werden bestormd.
The international financial system, the way it worked, clearly contributed to the spread of the crisis in Germany, and that led to contraction of the economy. So that was one of the factors that contributed to the downward spiral.
What had been a local affair, that is a largely American affair, becomes a European-wide depression in a continent which itself has been suffering almost for the whole decade from a very weak economy. Not like the United States. Europe hadn't been booming during the 20s, but in fact was suffering all the consequences of a devastating World War I, only was beginning to rebuild its industry and its agricultural economy and so on.
Germany had been in an economic mess all through the 1920s. Remember the horrendous mega inflation of the 1920s just about wiped out the German middle class in the 1920s. And a lot of that was the spillover from the horrible terms of the Versailles Treaty.
Those debts, war reparation debts and war loan debts, hang over the economy, depressing it further until finally the depression spreads from the United States to Europe.
And when you look at the German deal, that what Germany got vis-a-vis France, and what France did to Germany in that period, and what the UK, along with France, did, and what the US allowed to happen to Germany, we hurt Germany in a way that damaged stable democracy, of course.
Et la France a tout fait pour favoriser l'extrême droite. On est parti de l'idée, puisque l'économie allemande va mal, c'est que c'est bénéficiaire pour la France. Et ça, c'était faux.
Il y a eu en fait un processus dans lequel, à mon avis, les Français se sont révélés aveuglés par leur désir de revanche et il fait l'erreur colossale. Et évidemment, la crise est arrivée là-dessus. La crise n'a rien arrangé.
C'est une république qui recommence à exister, à respirer. Et c'est 1929 qui a cassé cette dynamique, qui a immédiatement, sur un corps fragilisé par les crises antérieures, rouvert la plaie Alors pour moi, il n'y a pas de doute possible que c'est la crise de 1929 qui a provoqué cette montée aux extrêmes, et la crise est venue frapper un corps malade, fatigué, qui n'a trouvé d'issue que dans le nazisme.
De Duitse industrie stortte in elkaar. De faillissementen namen toe en er waren meer dan 6 miljoen werklozen. De Duitsers waren ontgoocheld en kwaad. In veel steden werden hongermarsen gehouden en ook de soepbedelingen doken weer op.
Nous habitions dans la Mendelssohnstraße et je me souviens de ma grand-mère distribuant une sorte de soupe à l'entrée et je demandais qu'est-ce que c'est que ça? C'est pour les chômeurs. C'est la première fois que j'ai entendu le mot chômeur.
Il y a un parallélisme tout à fait étonnant entre l'Allemagne et les États-Unis tout au long de cette période. Dans les deux cas, le taux de chômage va monter à 25% et on va voir exactement le même effondrement à la fois des prix, de la production qu'aux États-Unis. Les pays européens vont absorber la crise d'une manière qui va être plus ou moins tragique, mais qui ne sera jamais aussi spectaculaire que ce qu'on observera aussi bien en Allemagne qu'aux États-Unis.
In Amerika deinde de schokgolf van de beursval verder uit, tot de recessie zich in een neerwaartse spiraal steeds dieper liet voelen. De industriële productie daalde met de helft en duizenden gezinnen leefden van de soepbedeling.
The economy did not recover, and by June, because spring was usually the big month for when the economy begins to perk up for the coming season, didn't happen. And as a result, the bottom just sort of fell out of the market again, and the country drifted along until about October. And it's not until really about October of 30 that the country begins to fall into a depression.
De sterkste bastions waren niet bestand tegen de beurscrash. Na de snelle opgang zonk het land nu hopeloos weg. 1 op de 5 werknemers was werkloos. Het volk leek wel verdoofd. In New York belanden elke maand 17.000 gezinnen op straat. Honderdduizenden werklozen, onder wie veel bedienden, vochten om te overleven. Urenlang trotseerden ze de kou voor een kom soep en een homp brood.
The government has no safety programs, no safety net welfare programs. There is no unemployment insurance. So as people lose jobs and they're thrown on the streets, they have nowhere to go but to private charities. And those private charities are just completely overwhelmed.
My early memories of the Depression was seeing my mother standing on one of these lines to get food, ashamed of being poor, ashamed of having to ask somebody for something. I remember that, very vividly, because it was very painful to see her on this line waiting to get some food. As the Depression got worse, we moved from bad tenements to worse tenements. Of course, another thing I remember is my own family. My father was a waiter. When the Depression came, there was less work, and so my father had to do many other things. Desperately, he became a salesman of ties, of neckties, because I remember I felt very ashamed. Walking past down the street to school, and there was my father selling ties on the street. And to this day, I'm ashamed of my own reaction. And another time he became a window cleaner, and he did that until he fell from one of his window cleaning jobs and hurt himself. And I remember my father doing some cleaning streets or something like that.
And that's part of the awful tragedy of the Depression. It's literally etched on the faces of people. Men get up and they go out to look for work, and they know they're not going to find anything. And so they're going to spend half the day sitting on a park bench feeling useless.
It was a reality that it was very difficult to escape from. I think you couldn't go anywhere without seeing the signs of depression. You couldn't go anywhere without seeing the boarded up stores, the factories that were not working, the people standing on the street. In the early phases of the Depression, many men, for instance, still dressed up as if they were going to work because they didn't want to tell their families. They were too embarrassed to tell their families that they were unemployed, but then they would stand around in their work clothing all day in the street to be away from home, to be somewhere else.
Meer en meer mensen namen deel aan de zogenaamde dansmarathons. Door de recessie waren ze tot alles bereid. De regels waren simpel. Je hoefde alleen zo lang mogelijk te dansen, soms wel dagen aan een stuk. Het laatste danspaar dat overeind bleef, won $500. Tot groot vermaak van de toeschouwers, die even hun eigen ellende konden vergeten. Aan alles werd gedacht. Er waren dokters, bedden en voedsel. De verliezers kregen op zijn minst een hap te eten.
That's one of the things that I remember. Of course, another thing I remember is people being evicted from their tenements. Even as low as the rents were, they could not afford to pay them. And so the police would come, they'd take their furniture and put them out on the street. And I remember as a little boy going by these scenes of furniture out on the streets, and you know, you might see the mother crying, weeping, you know, because it was not only that they had lost their home, but it was psychologically humiliating for them to have all of their possessions in full view of everybody, and for everybody to know that they could not pay their rent. But once or twice I saw scenes of rebellion, people organizing to move the furniture back, to defy the police, and this happened several times.
People, as they lost their homes, had to go somewhere, and they went largely into these makeshift huts that they put together with cardboard and tin and leftover materials. They slept in caves in Central Park.
There are tent cities all over America of homeless people that are called Hoovervilles in mocking disdain for what Hoover has visited upon the country.
Central Park in New York City had a number of Hoovervilles, and Hoovervilles were for a number of years the shame of our society.
Once I lived the life of a millionaire, spending my money, Lord, I didn't care. I carried my friends out for a mighty good time, buying bootleg liquor, champagne and wine. Then I begun to fall so low. Didn't have no money and no place to go. If I get my hands on a dollar again, I'm gonna hold on to it till the eagle grins, because nobody knows you when you're down and out. In your pockets, not one penny, and your friends you have not any. But when you get on your feet again, everybody wants to be your long-lost friend. It's mighty strange, without a doubt. No man can use you when you're down and out. Lord, I mean when you're down